The summer heat in London was unbearable that afternoon. Tourist buses lined the streets near Buckingham Palace, and crowds of visitors pushed against the metal barriers, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old construction worker from Chicago who had saved for 3 years to afford this European vacation. Marcus had started drinking early that morning. What began as a celebration beer at his hotel had turned into a pub crawl through Westminster. By the time he reached the palace gates, his vision was blurry and his judgment completely clouded. The expensive whiskey he'd been sampling at each pub had mixed with the afternoon sun to create a dangerous combination. The royal guards stood motionless in their bright red uniforms and towering bearskin helmets. Their discipline was legendary. They never flinched, never spoke, never acknowledged the tourists who constantly tried to make them break character. For Marcus, their stillness was like a challenge he couldn't ignore. He pulled out his phone and started recording, stumbling, closer to the guards stationed at the main gate. The crowd around him grew uncomfortable as his voice got louder and his movements more erratic. Other tourists began stepping away, sensing trouble brewing. "Come on, mate," Marcus shouted at the guard, his American accent thick with alcohol. "Just smile for the camera. Don't be so serious all the time." The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged behind the chin strap of his ceremonial helmet. The crowd watched nervously as Marcus became more agitated by the guard's professional silence. Security personnel noticed the disturbance and began moving closer, but they were still several yards away. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small glass bottle of whiskey he'd purchased as a souvenir. What happened next would be captured by dozens of phones and broadcast around the world within hours. Marcus, in his drunken state, decided that if words wouldn't get a reaction, perhaps something more dramatic would. The bottle felt heavy in his unsteady hand as he raised it above his head. The guard, whose name was Private James Morrison, had been serving for 2 years. He had endured countless provocations from tourists, people pulling faces, making loud noises, even attempting to touch his uniform. But nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. Marcus brought the bottle down hard against the side of the guard's bearskin helmet. The glass shattered on impact, sending whiskey and fragments flying. The crowd gasped in horror as the amber liquid ran down the guard's face and uniform. For a moment, that seemed to stretch forever. Everyone stood frozen in shock. Private Morrison felt the impact through his helmet, the alcohol stinging his eyes and the smell of whiskey filling his nostrils. Years of military training had taught him to remain composed under pressure, but this was beyond anything he'd experienced. The weight of his ceremonial sword at his side suddenly felt very real. The tourists around them began screaming and backing away. Some continued filming while others called for security. Marcus stood there, the broken bottle neck still in his hand, suddenly realizing the gravity of what he'd done. The alcohol fog in his brain began to clear as he saw the whiskey dripping. From the guard's pristine uniform, security guards were running now, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder by the second. The crowd that had been leisurely taking photos moments before was now in chaos, with parents grabbing their children and tourists pushing to get away from the scene. Marcus looked at the guard's face, expecting anger or retaliation. Instead, he saw something that chilled him to the bone, the same unwavering professionalism, but now with a cold intensity that made him realize he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The guard's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his sword, a movement so subtle that only Marcus noticed it. The broken glass crunched under Marcus's feet as he took a step backward, finally understanding that his drunken prank had become an international incident that would follow him for the rest of his life. Private James Morrison's response was swift and calculated. Instead of breaking his ceremonial stance or drawing his sword as many expected, he did something that caught everyone completely off guard. He reached up with his left hand, wiped the whiskey from his eyes with military precision, and then stepped forward with authority that made the entire crowd fall silent. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries of British military tradition. "Sir, you have just committed an assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard," he announced clearly, his words cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. The crowd pressed closer, mesmerized by hearing the famously silent guard speak. Marcus dropped the broken bottle, glass tinkling on the pavement. His face went white as the full impact of the guard's words hit him. This wasn't just a prank gone wrong. This was a serious crime committed in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless recording devices. The guard continued, his tone never wavering from perfect military composure. "You will remain exactly where you are until the appropriate authorities arrive. Any attempt to leave will be considered resisting arrest." His hand rested casually on his sword hilt, a subtle but unmistakable warning that he was prepared to enforce his words. What shocked the bystanders most wasn't the guard's authority, it was his complete calm. They had expected shouting, anger, perhaps even violence. Instead, they witnessed a masterclass in military discipline and control. The guard's uniform was stained with whiskey and flecked with glass, but his posture remained perfect, his voice steady. Social media exploded within minutes. Videos of the incident spread across platforms faster than anyone could track them. The hashtag #DonorGuard response began trending worldwide as people shared their amazement at the guard's professional reaction. News outlets picked up the story, and within an hour it was being broadcast internationally. Marcus stood frozen, surrounded by an ever-growing crowd of onlookers. Some tourists had initially been sympathetic to his obvious intoxication, but the guard's dignified response had shifted public opinion completely. Now they looked at Marcus with disgust and disapproval. He could hear people calling him names. In various languages, their anger palpable. The first police officers arrived within 3 minutes, their vehicles' blue lights flashing as they pushed through the crowd. Sergeant Patricia Collins, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, took control of the scene immediately. She had dealt with countless incidents at royal locations, but this one was already shaping up to be extraordinary. "Private Morrison," she addressed the guard formally. "Are you injured?" Her respect for the military was evident in her tone and bearing. "No injury, Sergeant," Morrison replied crisply. "However, my uniform has been damaged, and the perpetrator struck my helmet with significant force. I believe charges of assault on a public official and destruction of crown property would be appropriate." The crowd murmured appreciatively at the guard's professional assessment. Even in the aftermath of being attacked, he was thinking clearly and following proper procedures. Several tourists began applauding spontaneously, showing their support for the guard's remarkable composure. Marcus tried to speak, his voice shaky and slurred. I didn't mean... It was just supposed to be funny." His words trailed off as he realized how pathetic he sounded. The guard's dignity made his own behavior appear even more shameful in contrast. Sergeant Collins approached Marcus, her handcuffs already in hand. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault and criminal damage. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Her voice was firm but not unkind, though her disgust at his actions was barely concealed. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Marcus felt the weight of his mistake settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The crowd watched as he was led away, some still filming, others shaking their heads in dismay. He could hear fragments of conversations in the crowd, people discussing his stupidity, praising the guard's response, and speculating about what would happen next. Private Morrison remained at his post as the scene was cleared and cleaned. A replacement uniform was brought to him, and he changed with the same precision he brought to everything else. When he resumed his position, the crowd that had gathered gave him a spontaneous round of applause that echoed across the palace grounds. The incident had transformed from a moment of chaos into something else entirely, a demonstration of the values that the Royal Guard represented, and a stark contrast between honor and foolishness that would be remembered for years to come. The police van carrying Marcus Webb wound through London's busy streets toward the central booking facility. Inside, Marcus sat in stunned silence, his hands still cuffed behind his back, the smell of whiskey clinging to his clothes like evidence of his poor judgment. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate through his alcohol-clouded mind with crystal-clear brutality. Detective Inspector Sarah Kahn was waiting at the station when they arrived. She had been following the incident through social media and knew this case would require delicate handling due to the international attention it was already receiving. A 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, she had seen tourists make foolish mistakes before, but nothing quite this spectacular. The booking process was thorough and humiliating for Marcus. His belongings were catalogued, his fingerprints taken, and his photograph captured for official records. Each step drove home the seriousness of what he had done. The desk sergeant processing him shook his head repeatedly, clearly disgusted by the assault on one of Britain's most respected institutions. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, private, Morrison was being debriefed by his commanding officer, Captain William Hartley. The captain had served for 20 years and had never encountered anything quite like this incident. He was simultaneously proud of Morrison's professional response and concerned about the precedent it might set for future interactions with difficult tourists. "Your conduct was exemplary, Private Morrison," Captain Hartley said, reviewing the incident reports and witness statements. "However, this situation has created some unique challenges we need to address. The media attention is unprecedented, and there will likely be questions about our protocols moving forward." Morrison stood at attention, his replacement uniform immaculate despite the day's events. "Sir, I simply followed my training and maintained the dignity of the Guard. The tourists' behavior was unacceptable, and I responded appropriately to protect both myself and the reputation of the regiment." The captain nodded approvingly. Morrison's response had been textbook perfect, but the situation was far from over. Phone calls were already coming in from news organizations, government officials, and even international diplomatic channels. The simple assault of a guard had become a global talking point about respect, tradition, and consequences. Back at the police station, Marcus was finally allowed to make his phone call. With trembling fingers, he dialed his brother David back in Chicago. The conversation was painful and awkward, filled with long silences as David processed what Marcus had done. "You did what?" David's voice cracked with disbelief. "Marcus, this isn't some local bar fight. You attacked a guard at the Queen's Palace. This is going to be everywhere. Mom and Dad are going to see this on the news. The weight of disappointing..." His family hit Marcus harder than any legal consequence could. His parents had been so proud when he'd finally saved enough money for his dream trip to Europe. Now their son would be known worldwide as the drunk American who disrespected British tradition in the most public way possible. Detective Inspector Kahn entered the interview room, carrying a thick folder of witness statements and evidence. The interview was being recorded, and Marcus's court-appointed solicitor, James Pemberton, sat beside him taking notes. Pemberton was experienced in tourist-related incidents, but had never handled something with this level of international scrutiny. "Mr. Webb," Detective Kahn began, her voice professional but not unsympathetic, "you're facing serious charges here. Assault on a public official, criminal damage to Crown property, and public disorder. The evidence against you is overwhelming. We have dozens of witnesses and countless video recordings of the incident." Marcus slumped in his chair, finally grasping the magnitude of his situation. The videos that tourists had taken weren't just embarrassing memories. They were evidence that would be used against him in court. His solicitor leaned over to whisper advice, but Marcus barely heard the words. "I was drunk," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it would be funny. I never meant to hurt anyone or cause this much trouble. I just wanted to get a reaction." Detective Khan studied his face, recognizing genuine remorse when she saw it. "Mr. Webb, the guard you assaulted showed remarkable restraint and professionalism. His response has earned him praise from around the world, while your actions have brought shame not just to yourself, but to your country in the eyes of many international observers." The interview continued for 2 hours, covering every detail of Marcus's day leading up to the incident. His story of pub crawling and poor decisions painted a picture of someone who had lost control completely. By the end, even his solicitor looked uncomfortable with the case he would have to defend. That evening, as Marcus sat in his holding cell, the full scope of his mistake was playing out on television screens around the world. News anchors discussed the incident. Social media continued buzzing with opinions, and Private Morrison was being hailed as a model of military professionalism and British dignity. The morning after the incident brought a media storm that neither Marcus nor the authorities had anticipated. Every major news network was covering the story, and the contrast between the guard's professionalism and the tourist's behavior had captured global attention in a way that surprised everyone involved. Marcus woke up in his cell to find that his case had become an international sensation overnight. His solicitor, James Pemberton, arrived early with newspapers from around the world, all featuring headlines about the incident. The Guardian called it a study in contrasts, dignity versus disgrace. The New York Times ran it as American Tourists' Attack on British Guard Sparks Global Debate. What made the story even more compelling was the emergence of Private Morrison's background. Investigative journalists had discovered that the 24-year-old guard was a decorated veteran who had served tours in Afghanistan before joining the ceremonial unit. His military record was exemplary, making the attack on him seem even more outrageous to public opinion. At the American Embassy in London, cultural attaché Margaret Stevens was dealing with the diplomatic fallout from the incident. Phone calls were pouring in from British officials, American tourist organizations, and media outlets seeking comment on what many were calling a disgraceful representation of American tourists abroad. This is exactly the kind of incident that reinforces negative stereotypes about Americans traveling overseas, Stevens explained to her staff during an emergency briefing. "We need to handle this carefully to minimize damage to our cultural relations with the UK." Marcus's family back in Chicago was experiencing their own nightmare. His mother, Linda Webb, had stopped answering her phone after the third call from a reporter wanting to discuss her son's behavior. His father, Robert, was fielding calls at his auto repair shop from customers who had recognized the family name in news reports. "I raised him better than this," Linda sobbed to her husband as they watched CNN replay the incident for the dozenth time. "How could he do something so stupid and disrespectful? That poor guard was just doing his job." The video footage was being analyzed frame by news organizations around the world. Slow-motion replays showed the exact moment the bottle struck the helmet, the whiskey splashing across the guard's face, and most importantly, the incredible composure with which Private Morrison handled the situation. Social media had divided into clear camps. Team Morrison supporters were sharing memes celebrating the guard's professionalism and calling for Marcus to face the full consequences of his actions. A smaller group was arguing that the punishment seemed excessive for what they called a drunken prank gone wrong. British morning talk shows were having field days with the story. Television hosts brought on military experts to explain the significance of the Royal Guard's role and the severity of attacking a member of the ceremonial unit. The consensus was unanimous. Marcus had committed not just a crime, but a cultural offense that went to the heart of British identity. At Westminster Magistrates' Court, preparations were underway for what was already being called the most high-profile tourist assault case in recent memory. Court officials were coordinating with security services to manage the expected media presence and public interest in the proceedings. Marcus's court appearance was scheduled for the following day, giving his legal team precious little time to prepare a defense strategy. Pemberton was realistic about their chances. The evidence was overwhelming, the public sentiment was strongly against his client, and the international attention meant the court would likely want to make an example of the case. Meanwhile, Private Morrison was trying to return to his normal duties, but the constant attention from both media and tourists was making that impossible. Every time he took his post, crowds would gather, hoping to see the guard who had handled the attack with such dignity. His commanding officers were considering reassigning him temporarily until the furor died down. The incident had also sparked broader discussions about tourist behavior at cultural sites worldwide. Museums, monuments, and ceremonial locations began reviewing their security protocols and considering stricter penalties for disrespectful behavior. Marcus spent another sleepless night in his cell, knowing that the next day would determine his immediate future. His solicitor had been honest about the likely outcomes. Jail time was almost certain, followed by deportation and a lifetime ban from entering the United Kingdom. The irony wasn't lost on him that his dream vacation to see British culture and history had ended with him becoming part of both in the worst possible way. His name would forever be associated with disrespect toward one of Britain's most cherished traditions. As dawn broke over London, both Marcus and Private Morrison prepared for a day that would define how the story would be remembered. One would face justice for his actions, while the other would be celebrated as an example of honor under pressure. The global audience that had been captivated by the initial incident was now waiting to see how British justice would handle an American tourist who had crossed one of the most visible lines in international diplomacy and cultural respect. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers when Marcus Webb arrived for his hearing. Flanked by police officers, he kept his head down as camera flashes exploded around him and reporters shouted questions he couldn't bring himself to answer. The walk from the police van to the courthouse doors felt like the longest journey of his life. Inside Westminster Magistrates Court, District Judge Patricia Hawthorne reviewed the case file with growing incredulity. In 30 years on the bench, she had presided over thousands of cases, but few had generated this level of international attention or carried such cultural significance. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching from monitors in adjacent rooms. Marcus sat in the dock wearing the same clothes from the day before, now wrinkled and still carrying the faint smell of whiskey. His solicitor, James Pemberton, had worked through the night preparing mitigation arguments, but both men knew they were fighting an uphill battle against overwhelming evidence and public sentiment. The prosecutor, Crown Attorney Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to the guard, stood to present the case with clinical precision. She outlined the charges methodically: assault occasioning actual bodily harm against a public official, criminal damage to Crown property valued at over $500, and public disorder. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity and supported by irrefutable evidence. Your Honor, Morrison addressed the court, the defendant's actions represent more than mere criminal behavior. This was an assault on a symbol of British heritage and tradition, committed in full view of hundreds of witnesses and broadcast to millions worldwide. The victim, Private James Morrison, demonstrated extraordinary restraint and professionalism in the face of an unprovoked attack. When the prosecution played the video evidence, the courtroom fell silent. Even having seen it countless times in news reports, watching it in the formal setting of a criminal trial gave it new weight and gravity. The sound of glass breaking against the guard's helmet echoed through the quiet courtroom like a gunshot. Marcus winced as he watched himself on the screen, seeing his own actions from the outside for the first time with complete clarity. A person in the video looked like a stranger, aggressive, disrespectful, and completely out of control. He barely recognized himself in that drunken fool who had thought attacking a guard would be entertaining. Judge Hawthorne listened to victim, Impact statements read on behalf of Private Morrison and the regiment. The guard's statement was measured and professional, focusing on the damage to military property and the breach of security protocols rather than personal grievances. His dignity, even in his victim statement, only served to highlight the contrast with Marcus's behavior. When it came time for the defense, Pemberton did his best with limited options. He highlighted Marcus's previously clean criminal record, his expression of genuine remorse, and his cooperation with the investigation. He painted a picture of a young man who had made a catastrophically poor decision while intoxicated, not someone with malicious intent toward British institutions. "Your Honor," Pemberton pleaded, "my client is deeply ashamed of his actions and fully accepts responsibility for what he did. This was an aberration in an otherwise law-abiding life, the result of poor judgment compounded by alcohol consumption. He never intended to cause international incident or disrespect to British traditions." Marcus was then asked to speak on his own behalf. Standing in the dock, his voice shaky with emotion, he addressed the court and, by extension, the watching world. "Your Honor, I want to apologize unreservedly for my actions. What I did was stupid, disrespectful, and inexcusable. Private Morrison was just doing his job, and I had no right to attack him or damage his uniform." His voice broke slightly as he continued, "I've brought shame not just on myself, but on my family and my country. I understand that my actions have consequences, and I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate. I just hope that someday I can make amends for the damage I've caused." The courtroom was silent as Marcus sat down. Many observers noting that his remorse appeared genuine, even if it came too late to undo the damage he had caused. Judge Hawthorne took a brief recess to consider sentencing, leaving Marcus to contemplate his fate while the media outside speculated about the likely outcome. Legal experts being interviewed on television were predicting significant jail time and immediate deportation following his sentence. When court resumed, Judge Hawthorne's expression was grave as she prepared to deliver sentence. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as she began to speak, knowing that her words would determine Marcus's immediate future and send a message about how seriously British courts treat attacks on their ceremonial traditions. The moment of truth had arrived for Marcus Webb, whose drunken prank had escalated into an international incident that would define the rest of his life. The contrast between his current position and Private Morrison's growing reputation as a model of military professionalism could not have been starker. Judge Hawthorne's voice carried the weight of British legal tradition as she delivered her sentence. "Mr. Webb, your actions represent a serious assault on both an individual and an institution that embodies centuries of British heritage. The fact that this occurred in full public view, with international media coverage, makes it impossible to treat this as a simple case of tourist misbehavior." Marcus felt his legs weaken as the judge continued. "I sentence you to 6 months imprisonment, suspended for 2 years, conditional on your immediate deportation from the United Kingdom and a lifetime ban on re-entry. You will also pay $2,500 in compensation for damage to Crown property and court costs." The suspended sentence meant Marcus would avoid immediate jail time, but only if he left Britain immediately and never returned. The lifetime ban was particularly crushing. His dream of exploring European history and culture was permanently ended by his own actions. As Marcus was led from the dock, the international media erupted into a frenzy of reporting. The sentence was seen as firm but fair, sending a clear message about respecting British institutions while acknowledging his genuine remorse and cooperation. Private Morrison, watching the proceedings on television from his barracks, felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but he took no pleasure in seeing another young man's life derailed by poor choices. His commanding officer approached him with news that would change his life as dramatically as the incident had changed. "Marcus's Private Morrison," Captain Hartley announced, In recognition of your exemplary conduct during and after this incident, you're being recommended for promotion to Lance Corporal. Additionally, the palace has requested that you be considered for a commendation for your professional handling of an unprecedented situation. The promotion was unprecedented for someone with Morrison's length of service, but his conduct had elevated him to a symbol of military professionalism that the regiment was proud to recognize. His calm response under pressure had become a textbook example of how to maintain dignity in crisis. Meanwhile, Marcus was being processed for deportation at an immigration facility near Heathrow Airport. His parents had flown in from Chicago, their faces etched with disappointment and love in equal measure. The reunion was painful but necessary. Their son needed their support, even if they couldn't excuse his actions. "We still love you, Marcus," his mother said through tears. "But you need to understand how badly you've hurt people. That guard didn't deserve what you did to him, and now you have to live with the consequences." The flight back to Chicago was a nightmare of recognition and whispered conversations. Fellow passengers had seen the news coverage, and Marcus spent the entire journey avoiding eye contact and wishing he could disappear. The flight attendants were professional but cold, clearly aware of who he was and what he had done. Back in London, Private Morrison returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. Tourists now approached with visible respect, many thanking him personally for his service and professionalism. Children asked their parents about the brave guard, and his story was being taught in schools as an example of grace under pressure. The incident had spawned documentaries, news specials, and academic papers about cultural respect, tourist behavior, and military discipline. Morrison found himself reluctantly famous, a role he handled with the same quiet dignity he had shown during the original incident. Marcus arrived in Chicago to find his story had preceded him. Local news stations wanted interviews, but he declined them all. His employer at the construction company was understanding but firm. The negative publicity made it impossible for him to return to his old job. He would have to rebuild his life from scratch. Months later, Marcus enrolled in community college and began volunteer work with organizations that helped troubled youth. He spoke at schools about the consequences of poor decisions, always emphasizing how one moment of stupidity had destroyed his dreams and hurt an innocent person. His story became a cautionary tale told to young travelers about respecting local customs and the permanent consequences of temporary poor judgment. Tourist guidebooks began including warnings about appropriate behavior at ceremonial sites, with Marcus's case cited as an example of how far the consequences could reach. Private Morrison, now Lance Corporal Morrison, continued his exemplary service. He married his longtime girlfriend in a ceremony attended by military dignitaries who praised his character. His response to the incident had made him a role model for young soldiers throughout the British military. The broken whiskey bottle was disposed of, the uniform was replaced, and the palace gates were cleaned. But the impact of that afternoon lived on. Two young men's lives had been forever changed by a single moment. One elevated by his character under pressure, the other humbled by the consequences of his lack of it. The story became part of London's folklore, told to tourists as they visited Buckingham Palace. Guides would point to the spot where it happened and remind visitors that the guards they were watching were real soldiers deserving of respect, not tourist attractions to be provoked or tested. Years later, both Marcus and Morrison would occasionally think about that summer afternoon and how completely it had redirected their lives. One learned that dignity under pressure could elevate a person beyond their circumstances, while the other discovered that some mistakes echo far longer and louder than anyone could imagine.